Some nurses think reading a few textbooks makes them surgeons. Those are the ones who kill patients. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 11 minutes before the Marine commander's artery ruptured in Bay 3. Laura Bennett moves through the trauma bay at St. Michael's in San Antonio with the kind of efficiency that unnerves people. No wasted motion. No deference to the physician hierarchy that Dr. Caldwell has spent 23 years building. The fluorescent lights hum overhead, antiseptic stench mixing with fresh blood as she preps a laceration tray. Her hands are rock-steady despite the thin white scars visible on her knuckles when she snaps on the nitrile gloves, the kind of scars that don't come from paper cuts or kitchen accidents. In her locker, one level down from the break room, a pair of worn combat boots sits wrapped in plastic. The left one is stained dark brown. She has been here 18 months. 18 months of keeping her head down, her voice measured, her movements precise. 18 months of watching physicians like Caldwell move through these corridors like they own them, and maybe they do. The personnel file in the hospital systems database lists a 2-year gap in her employment history. Missionary work abroad, she'd written in the blank space, and the hiring manager had nodded and moved on. But Caldwell doesn't move on. Caldwell notices things. Caldwell has started asking questions at staff meetings, his eyes tracking her with the focus of a man who has learned to smell weakness, to exploit inconsistencies, to build cases against people who don't fit neatly into his org chart. The intake alert comes through at 6:44 p.m. A VA transfer from Lackland Medical, Ambulance Route 7, ETA 4 minutes. Laura glances at the dispatch screen mounted above the central workstation. Her colleague, Janet Morrison, is already prepping Bay 1. But when Laura reads the patient designation on the transfer sheet, something shifts in her spine. Marine Commander. History of combat injury sustained in Tikrit. Acute pain in the left flank. Vital stable on transport but trending toward tachycardia. The text blurs slightly, not from her eyes, but from the way her peripheral vision seems to narrow when certain names from certain years surface in her present. She breathes in through her nose. Out through her mouth. The ritual is so practiced it's invisible to anyone watching. She's done it 10,000 times in a decade and a half. Pain is data. Adrenaline is just chemistry. Her hands don't tremble because her hands learned a long time ago that trembling kills people. The stretcher wheels squeak against the tile as the transport crew wheels the commander into Bay 3. His conscious, jaw clenched, left hand pressed against his abdomen. Dark spots on his hospital gown that tell Laura everything the transport notes didn't. The paramedic hands off vitals to Dr. Caldwell, who is already in the bay, rolling up his sleeves with the deliberate precision of a man who has rehearsed this entrance 1,000 times. 32-year-old male, motor vehicle accident, blunt force trauma to the left flank, no loss of consciousness, BP holding steady at 118/76, the paramedic recites. Clean handoff. Professional. The kind of work that keeps people alive. Laura watches from the doorway for exactly one breath. Then she moves. She's already pulling the trauma shears from her pocket, the ones with her initials engraved in tiny letters on the steel, a habit from another life, and cutting away the gown as Caldwell barks orders at the med students shadowing him. 2 large bore 4s, type and cross, get me an ultrasound. His voice carries the particular weight of someone who has never been questioned, never been wrong in his own mind. Laura establishes the first for line with the kind of smooth precision that comes from doing something 5,000 times. The needle slides into the vein at the ideal angle. No fumbling. No hesitation. The tourniquet comes off and she's already labeling the blood draw with date and time before Caldwell has finished his next sentence. I want a full trauma panel, CBC, comprehensive metabolic, lactate level, he continues, and Laura is already moving toward the ultrasound machine, positioning it at the bedside because the commander's left flank is where the problem lives. She doesn't wait to be asked. She doesn't defer. She just does. The ultrasound gel is cold against the commander's skin. She notes his sharp inhale, the way his jaw tightens further, the 1,000 microsignals that tell her this man has felt worse pain than this and lived through it. The image blooms across the screen. Fluid. Dark fluid in the abdomen where there shouldn't be any. Liver laceration, maybe a bleed from the spleen. The commander's spleen is probably dying in real time, bleeding into his peritoneal cavity, and the clock is already running. Laura's eyes move across the ultrasound screen with the focus of someone reading a map of a place she has to get to fast. She catches the radiologist's eye across the bay. Dr. Chen, who has been at St. Michael's for 7 years and has learned not to question how Laura seems to know what's coming before the vitals confirm it. Spleen's compromised, Laura says. Her voice is quiet. Calm. The kind of voice that belongs to someone who has already made peace with whatever happens next. Caldwell glances at her. Not quite dismissive. Not quite respectful. Somewhere in the grey area where he treats her like a competent technician and nothing more. We'll need to get him to CT before surgery, he says, already moving toward the phone to call up to the OR. Type and cross for 4 units. Get me a surgical consent. His pressure's dropping, Laura interrupts. Not loudly. Not with urgency that would panic the room. Just stating fact. 106/68. He's losing volume faster than we're replacing it. The commander's eyes move to hers for just a moment. Something there. Some recognition that she sees him, actually sees him, not the chart or the injury pattern but the man bleeding out on the gurney. His hand, the one not pressed against his abdomen, makes a small movement toward his pocket. Laura catches it with her peripheral vision. The kind of small gesture that military people make when they're about to give an order or reveal something classified or die without saying goodbye. But before his fingers reach whatever he was reaching for, the monitor beeps. Once. Twice. A rhythm change that steals everyone's attention. Caldwell is already ordering more fluids, more pressure, and Laura is 3 steps ahead of him, already reaching for the massive transfusion protocol kit because she has known for the past 90 seconds, that this is where the real fight starts. The bay becomes a symphony of motion. Gloves snapping like gunshots in the silence between orders. The ventilator already prepped. The sound of bags of blood being run wide open through the rapid infuser, that mechanical hiss that means time is collapsing. But that isn't what changes things. That isn't the moment that makes Caldwell's eyes narrow and his jaw harden in a way that Laura will come to recognize as the beginning of something she can't stop. The moment comes 4 hours later, long after the commander is stable in the ICU and Laura has stripped off her blood-soaked scrubs and scrubbed her hands until her scars burned. She's standing at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, feeding dollar bills into the slot with mechanical precision when she hears the voices. 2 attending physicians from the general surgery service, both men who respect Caldwell's authority the way people respect authority figures they're afraid of or grateful to. The kind of voices that don't drop into confidential tones because they genuinely don't think anyone important is listening. Did you see how she moved in there? The voice belongs to Dr. Pierce, the younger of the 2, the one with the expensive watch that Laura noticed last week. Stepping around Caldwell like she was running the show. I swear she was reaching for instruments before he even asked. The other voice is deeper. Older. Dr. Marcus Webb, who has been at St. Michael's long enough to remember when being a good physician meant something different than it does now. The nurse who thinks she's a surgeon. They both laugh. The sound is like gravel in a disposal. Laura's hand is still on the coffee she's pulling from the machine. The cup is warm. Her hand doesn't shake. Her breathing doesn't change. Her eyes don't close or gloss over or show the kind of emotion that would give them satisfaction. She turns to face them, steps 3 feet to her left so she's directly in their line of sight, and pours the coffee into her cup with the kind of deliberate slowness that is either complete indifference or the most controlled response possible. The laughter dies. Not suddenly. It just stops, the way a radio dies when you unplug it. Dr. Pierce's face flushes slightly. Dr. Webb's eyes narrow in a way that suggests he's suddenly wondering if he's said something he shouldn't have. Laura doesn't meet their gaze. She simply turns back to the machine, retrieves her coffee, and walks toward the stairs. Her spine is straight. Her shoulders are level. Her pace is neither slow nor rushed. She is a woman made of stone, and stone doesn't bruise. She doesn't know, can't possibly know, that Caldwell is already on his phone, already reaching into his network, already preparing the argument he'll use in grand rounds tomorrow. She doesn't know that he's noticed the gap in her file, really noticed it, and has started making calls to people who owe him favors, people who work in personnel departments and hospital administration. She doesn't know that her competence, her refusal to genuflect at the altar of his credentials, her quiet authority in the trauma bay, has triggered something in him that looks like professional concern but feels like personal threat. What she does know is that the coffee is bitter and that the commander's blood is still under her fingernails, and that somewhere in the darkness of whatever comes next, there are rules she'll have to follow and lines she can't cross and a silence she promised to keep 18 months ago when they told her to disappear. Thursday morning in the conference room at St. Michael's felt like a courtroom designed by someone who'd never heard of natural light. 30 residents packed the bleachers, surgical masks hanging loose around necks, notebooks balanced on knees, the smell of hand sanitizer and nervous anticipation thick as humidity. Dr. Caldwell stood at the podium like a conductor preparing an orchestra, Laura's case file projected on the screen behind him in letters large enough to read from the parking lot. This, he announced, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man about to make an example, is what I call dangerous freelancing. Laura sat in the back row, spine against the cold plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap. She'd known this was coming. The way his eyes had tracked her movements all week, the way he'd lingered by her station during rounds, the phone calls she'd overheard from his office. She'd worked in enough high-pressure environments to recognize a predator establishing dominance before the strike. Nurse Bennett, Caldwell continued, his emphasis on the title turning it into something approximating an insult, placed a 14-gauge chest tube on this patient without waiting for attending approval. Without consultation. Without the humility to recognize that protocol exists for a reason. He let the statement hang like smoke, letting the residents absorb it, calibrate their judgment. Laura's face remained exactly what it had always been, a still lake. No color shift. No tightness around the mouth. Certainly no indication that she'd placed that tube because the attending he'd referenced was scrubbed into another emergency and the patient was collapsing into tension pneumothorax, and the alternative to her action was the patient's death on the monitor. Perhaps, Caldwell said, using air quotes that looked ridiculous on a man with his bearing, nurse surgeon can explain to our residents why she believes the chain of command doesn't apply to her. 30 sets of eyes rotated toward her. She met none of them. Her attention fixed on a point 3 inches above the projector, the kind of focus nowhere stare she'd learned in places where looking at the wrong person could get you killed. Where not reacting was its own form of survival. Caldwell spent the next 12 minutes dissecting the decision, her hand placement, her approach angle, her apparent lack of respect for departmental hierarchy. His voice rose and fell with theatrical precision, a conductor ensuring every resident understood that this was a cautionary tale about ambition disguised as competence. About knowing your place. When he finally dismissed them, the residents filed out in the awkward shuffle of people who'd just watched a public execution and weren't sure whether to applaud or apologize. Laura waited until the room had emptied. Then she stood, straightened her scrubs, and walked out with the exact same pace she'd walked in. The kind of composure that turned heads. The kind that made people wonder if they'd actually witnessed what they thought they'd witnessed, or if they'd misread the entire situation. By Thursday afternoon, the vending machines outside the surgical wing had become Caldwell's unofficial headquarters. He stood there with Dr. Morrison, the kind of ally who followed power the way plants followed sunlight. Laura arrived at 1,447 hours to refill the coffee carafe for the trauma bay. She could hear them before she appeared around the corner. The nurse who thinks she's a surgeon, Morrison said, his laugh carrying the particular cruelty of someone punching down. Caldwell's response was immediate and satisfied. Give her 6 months. Either she washes out or the liability catches up with her. Either way, she's gone from my hospital. Laura's hand didn't hesitate as she pressed the button on the machine. The carafe filled with that particular hiss of hot liquid meeting ceramic, the sound steady and unhurried. She could feel Caldwell's gaze on her profile, waiting for the reaction he'd engineered. The flinch. The tremor in her fingers. The confirmation that his words had found their target. Her hand stayed perfectly still. The carafe filled. She withdrew it without a ripple. Then she turned, coffee in hand, and walked past them both with the kind of presence that made the space she occupied feel slightly larger when she left it. Neither man said another word. But the seed had been planted and Caldwell was already watering it with institutional power. That same Thursday evening, he took Dr. Hayes from the hospital board to dinner at a steakhouse on the River Walk. The conversation was carefully calibrated, nothing accusatory, nothing direct. Just concerns about liability, about experienced nurses overstepping scope, about recent incidents that might warrant board attention. Hayes listened the way board members always listened, with one ear on the bottom line and one ear on the possibility of malpractice insurance claims. By Friday morning, Hayes had passed along the concerns to the hospital administrator. By Friday afternoon, a flag had been added to Laura's personnel file. The machinery had begun its turn. Then the commander arrived, and everything accelerated. Jackson Torres came through the emergency department doors at 03 for 7 hours on a Saturday morning, transferred from the VA facility in Corpus Christi with a history of severe combat injury sustained in Tikrit. His chart was thick with redactions, classified notes that wouldn't open, unit designations that had been partially blacked out, service records that seemed to have holes in them. He was stable, alert, vitals within normal range. The transfer note indicated stable status. Monitoring recommended. By 04:01 hours, his blood pressure started its inexorable decline. Laura was running labs on a different patient when the monitor alarm began its urgent soprano wail. She heard it, that particular pitch that meant someone's circulatory system had decided to stage a quiet rebellion, and her body moved before her mind finished processing. Trauma responses don't wait for consciousness. They're older than thought. The cut-down site was Katie Rodriguez's domain, but Katie froze the moment Laura appeared at Torres's bedside. Not hesitation. Actual paralysis. Because what Katie saw in those first 3 seconds wasn't a nurse responding to a crisis. It was a technician executing a procedure with the fluid precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before, including in places where there were no supplies, no backup, no margin for error. Laura's hands moved with the kind of economy that comes from necessity. The cut-down site at the antecubital fossa, her fingers positioning a 14-gauge catheter with approach angle that wasn't quite textbook, the kind of angle someone learns when textbooks don't exist anymore, when you're in a field hospital in Anbar province with a tourniquet marine bleeding out and the veins are collapsed and you have maybe 90 seconds before decisions become academic. Where the hell did you learn that sequence? Katie whispered. Laura didn't answer. Her focus was absolute, the kind that creates its own silence. She was inside a particular space now, one where there was only the patient, the equipment, the numbers on the monitor, and the feel of access finding resistance before giving way. They stabilized Torres temporarily. Got fluids running. Controlled the immediate bleed. By 0 for 20, he was stable enough for imaging. The CT came back inconclusive. There was evidence of prior trauma, scar tissue dense enough to obscure the kind of internal architecture the radiologists normally relied on. Something was wrong with the pressure readings in Torres's abdomen, but the imaging wasn't catching it, and the attending, not Caldwell, thank God, some visiting surgeon from the University of Texas, seemed content to observe and monitor. Laura documented her concerns in the chart. Potential ongoing hemorrhage. Recommend serial imaging. Recommend surgical consultation. Then she paged Dr. Caldwell twice. No response. At 0530 hours, Laura pulled up Torres's military records. Most of them were locked behind a firewall that required clearance she technically didn't have. But enough of it was visible, enough unit designations, enough redacted dates that coincided with dates she remembered. Tikrit. 2009, Joint Special Operations Command Liaison Operations. The kind of work you don't discuss and that the government prefers to pretend doesn't exist. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Katie appeared beside her like a ghost materializing from the fluorescent lights. Her voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. You were there, weren't you? In country. Laura's hand stilled. Then she closed the screen with the kind of decisive motion that closes doors. "I don't know what you mean." "Your hands," Katie said. "The way you positioned the catheter. That's not how they teach it in trauma certification. That's something else. That's something." I said, "I don't know what you mean." But Katie's expression had already shifted into something complicated. Understanding. Suspicion. The beginning of a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. And Laura understood in that moment that the careful architecture she'd built here, the 18 months of competent invisibility, the quiet efficiency, the refusal to seek recognition, had developed a single fault line. One observation. One moment of her hands remembering things her civilian credentials couldn't explain. And now someone had noticed. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant electric drone. The trauma bay was quiet for Saturday morning, just the ambient beeping of monitors, the distant wail of an ambulance approaching from the interstate. Laura logged out of the patient records and stood without speaking. Katie didn't follow. The next 4 hours passed in the rhythm of a hospital that didn't know it was holding its breath. Commander Torres remained stable in the surgical recovery bay, his vitals climbing steadily as the morning shift transitioned into afternoon. 68 beats per minute. Blood pressure holding at 118/72. His color improving from the gray-white of exsanguination to something almost human again. Laura moved between stations with the economy of motion she'd learned in places where wasted energy meant wasted blood, checking on 3 other patients, running labs, replacing 4 bags, speaking only when the work required it. Katie Rodriguez had disappeared after the cut down, and Laura didn't follow. Some people needed distance from what they'd witnessed. Some people needed time to decide whether they'd seen anything at all. At 3:47 in the afternoon, Dr. Caldwell's voice carried across the nurses' station from somewhere near the administrative wing, loud, agitated, words clipped short like he was distributing blame in efficient parcels. Laura didn't look up from the chart she was updating. Torres's fluid intake was 300 milliliters below expected loss. Kidney function markers trending upward. The cut-down site was clean, no infection markers in the bloodwork, no signs of compartment syndrome developing in the leg. The kind of quiet success that went unnoticed because nobody had to come running, nobody had to code the patient, nobody had to cry in a supply closet afterward. But that wasn't the worst part. At 4:03 in the morning, the monitors started singing a different song. The alarm came first, a high-pitched shriek that cut through the pre-dawn silence like a knife through silk. Laura was in the adjacent bay running a sedimentation rate on a 42-year-old with community-acquired pneumonia when the sound registered, and muscle memory took over. She was moving before conscious thought caught up, her hand setting down the sample tube with deliberate care, her feet already turning toward the sound. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as she reached the recovery bay. Torres's chest was heaving. His lips had gone the color of wet concrete. The monitor showed the rhythm first, the sine wave that meant his heart was beating but not pumping, electrical activity without mechanical force, a rhythm that looked almost normal to the untrained eye but sounded wrong because the room suddenly lacked the percussion of a blood pressure, lacked the whisper of oxygen saturation climbing, lacked the sound of a human being surviving. Katie Rodriguez stood frozen at the foot of the bed, her hands half raised like she was asking a question nobody could answer. Her face had gone the color of old bone. Behind her, the crash cart sat 3 feet away, and no one had moved to open it. That was what made Laura understand immediately, not the monitor, not the vital signs, but the silence. The specific silence of medical professionals who recognized a problem they didn't know how to solve. The silence of people watching a patient die in front of them at 4 in the morning. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis arrived fully formed in Laura's mind because she'd seen it before in Tikrit, had seen the chest that looked fine on imaging and the heart that was drowning in its own pericardial sac, had felt the peculiar cold dread of knowing the patient had minutes, maybe less. Fluid was crushing Torres's heart, a slow suffocation from inside the membrane that was supposed to protect him. No breath was going to fix this. No medicine going to reverse it. Only one procedure would save him, and it required a needle, a specific angle, a subcostal approach that had to thread through the pericardium without nicking the myocardium, and a steady hand that didn't shake. Dr. Shah stood at the bedside, his attending physician's coat unbuttoned, his hands trembling as they reached for Torres's wrist. His eyes were the eyes of someone calculating the distance between the recovery bay and the operating room, the time it would take to get Torres to surgery, the time it would take to crack a sternum and get eyes on access to the heart, and arriving at a number that was too large. 20 minutes. Maybe 18 if they ran. Torres had maybe 6. "Call the code," Laura said. Her voice sounded like someone else's voice, someone calm, someone who had given orders in worse lighting with worse odds. "Get me the pericardiocentesis kit. 14-gauge angiocath. Now." Shah turned toward her. His mouth opened. His mouth closed. He was trying to decide whether to give an order to a nurse or follow the order from a nurse, and the 3 seconds it took him to choose were 3 seconds Torres's oxygen saturation was falling. 84. 79. 72. The monitor was screaming. The room was screaming. And Laura was already moving toward the supply cabinet, her hands already knowing exactly where the kit was stored, already opening it with one hand while the other was reaching for alcohol prep pads, already feeling the weight of a decision settling into her shoulders like a tactical vest. "I'll assist," she heard herself say. "Call the code. Page cardiothoracic. But I need room." Shah's hesitation lasted exactly 1 more second, and then something shifted in his face, recognition, maybe, or permission, or simple exhaustion at the weight of trying to kill someone and failing. He nodded once and turned toward the phone. The sound of him calling overhead code reached Laura's ears just as her hands found their position, just as the pericardiocentesis kit lay open on the sterile field, needle gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The O2 sat was down to 68. Torres's blood pressure had become theoretical. Her hands moved on their own. Subcostal approach, 5th or 6th intercostal space, just below the xiphoid process. The needle entered at the correct angle, the angle that came from muscle memory and training and nights in a trauma bay that didn't exist on any map anyone would admit to. The needle threaded through tissue, through the pericardium, and Laura withdrew the syringe slowly, letting gravity and pressure differential do the work. Blood. Dark, thick, arterial blood that meant someone's heart had been drowning, had been suffocating in its own fluid, had been 8 seconds away from stopping forever. She withdrew 30 milliliters. 40. The room suddenly felt different, suddenly felt like it had air pressure again. The monitor's scream became a wail, became a rhythm. Torres's blood pressure climbed like he was remembering how to live. 90/50. 98/60. 108/70. The sine wave on the monitor resolved into peaks and valleys, into a rhythm that meant oxygen was moving, meant blood was circulating, meant a Marine commander was going to sea tomorrow. Katie stood frozen at the foot of the bed, her eyes on Laura's hands, on the confidence that moved through them like they'd been doing this procedure in the dark under mortar fire. Laura stripped her gloves and handed the syringe to Shah, who took it with the careful reverence of someone holding a reason why his patient was still alive. The blood swirled in the syringe like an accusation. Like evidence. Like a truth that was about to become a problem. "Get him to the OR," Laura said quietly. "Cardiothoracic's waiting." Shah nodded and turned away, already on his radio, already moving Torres's transport toward the operating room where the real surgery could happen, where the wound that had caused this could be properly sealed. The room emptied in 30 seconds, staff, equipment, the body of the patient, leaving only Laura and Katie and the smell of antiseptic and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Katie's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Where the hell did you learn that sequence?" Laura didn't answer. She was already moving toward the supply cabinet to restock the kit, already moving toward the next task, already moving away from the moment. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 20 minutes later when Dr. Caldwell walked into the recovery bay, his surgical mask still around his neck, his face the color of a bruise about to happen. He'd been in the parking garage. He'd been scrubbing in. He'd been 8 minutes away, maybe 10, when the code was called. He'd been nothing in that moment, irrelevant, removed, unnecessary. And he understood, in the way that powerful men understand their own obsolescence, that he would never forgive her for it. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice could strip paint from walls. Could strip skin from bone. Could strip meaning from every word Laura had ever said about knowing her place. Laura turned from the supply cabinet. She met his eyes. She said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, and Caldwell's face went from bruise purple to something darker, something that looked like a man watching his authority dissolve in real time. He left without waiting for an answer because he already knew the answer. She'd saved a life he'd been minutes too late to save, and now he had to decide whether to accept that or burn everything down to prove that she was wrong. By the time Laura finished her documentation of the pericardiocentesis at 0437, Dr. Caldwell had made 3 phone calls from his office. The first was to board member Harrison, who owed him a favor from a malpractice deposition 8 years ago. The second was to board member Pierce, who'd contributed 6 figures to Caldwell's research fund. The third was to investigator Grayson, who'd gotten a case dismissed because of Caldwell's testimony. 3 phone calls. 3 grenades planted in 3 carefully tended gardens. By 0515, he'd filed a formal complaint with the Texas Board of Nursing, citing her performing invasive procedures without proper medical supervision and practicing medicine without a license, and by the time the morning shift arrived, the complaint had been forwarded to the state investigator with a recommendation for immediate action. Laura clocked out at 0600 and walked through the hospital lobby as the city was beginning to wake up, the first grey edge of dawn touching the windows, the first delivery trucks arriving, the first day shift walking through the doors with coffee and the kind of hope that came from not yet knowing what the day would hold. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. No idea that 3 days would be enough time for a photograph to appear on CNN, enough time for a Marine commander in a wheelchair to recognize a call sign, enough time for 22 years of erasure to become irrelevant. But that morning, she only knew the taste of copper in her mouth and the weight of her own hands, the hands that had saved a life and doomed a career in the same 8-second procedure, and she walked to her car in the pre-dawn quiet knowing that the world had shifted on its axis and there was no way to shift it back. The needle went in blind. No ultrasound. No fluoroscopy. Just the anatomical landmarks Laura's hands had learned in the dark under mortar fire, the pericardium a target she could find with her eyes closed. Commander Torres's heart was drowning in its own fluid, tamponade crushing every chamber, and there was no time for Dr. Caldwell to arrive from wherever he was pretending to be important. The attending resident, a man named Chen who'd watched her work the cut down with suspicion, stood frozen at the bedside, hands half raised as if he might stop her. She didn't ask permission. The 18-gauge needle slid between the 5th and 6th ribs, angled toward the left shoulder, feeling for the membrane that separated blood from breath. The room held its silence like a patient holds a last breath before diving. O2 sat at 67. Dropping. Torres's blood pressure was a whisper, 52/28. His heart rate had climbed to 162, the rhythm erratic and weakening, and every second the pericardium stayed pressurized was a second closer to cardiac arrest. The needle advanced. Laura's fingers registered the subtle change in resistance as the point pierced the pericardial sac, that almost imperceptible pop of membrane giving way. She felt it. Felt it the way a sniper feels the moment before the rifle breaks, that singular point of transition between possibility and consequence. The syringe withdrew dark blood. Not the bright arterial red of a bleeder, but the old, dark blood of accumulation. The hiss of air escaping as pressure released. Torres's oxygen began climbing. 67 to 72 to 79. His heart rate dropped from 162 to 141. The blood pressure ticked upward, 54/30, then 58/32. Chen stepped back. Not in defeat, but in recognition. His hands lowered. She saw it in his face, the moment he understood that what he was watching wasn't protocol violation but mastery, the kind that couldn't be taught in residency, the kind that came from a place he would never access, a place where people learned medicine the way soldiers learned to survive. The final syringe withdrew 80 milliliters of blood, and Torres's vital signs climbed steadily back into the range that meant continued existence. Alive. Not stable. Not safe. But alive. The EKG traced sinus rhythm. The heart monitor beeped its steady percussion. Laura withdrew the needle and pressed a dressing over the small puncture wound, her hands perfectly steady. The trembling wasn't fear, it was the sudden awareness that she'd just performed a procedure that would be documented in a chart, witnessed by a resident, entered into the system where Dr. Caldwell would find it like blood in water. The doors burst open at 05 for 7 hours. Dr. Caldwell stood in the frame, already scrubbed, already ready to be the hero in this narrative, his face searching the room for the crisis he'd rushed to manage. Instead, he found the crisis already managed. Torres stable. Laura's hand still gloved, the syringe on the tray beside her, the pericardiocentesis completed. The chart would show exactly who'd performed it. The witnesses were assembled: Chen, 2 nurses, the respiratory therapist. There was no way to rewrite this, no way to bury it. Caldwell's face cycled through colors. Red. Deeper red. The kind of purple that comes from rage meeting the absolute inability to control the narrative. His eyes locked on the syringe of blood, then on Laura, then on the monitor displaying Torres's stable rhythm. 12 seconds of silence. Then Caldwell turned and walked out. Not running. Walking. The way a man walks when he's already planning the phone calls. By 0800 hours, before the morning shift had fully assembled, the network was moving. 3 phone calls made from Caldwell's office to board members he'd cultivated over 2 decades of climbing, careful conversations about autonomous scope creep, about liability exposure, about the danger of nurses who don't understand their lane. The language was precise, professional, the kind of language that makes institutional people nervous. By 0900 hours, a formal complaint filed with the Texas Board of Nursing, citing practice beyond scope of licensure, failure to follow physician orders, insubordination. By 0945 hours, a call to an investigator, a man named Garrett whom Caldwell had helped with a malpractice case 3 years ago, a favor now being collected. Garrett would make the right inquiries, ask the right questions, and the story would begin to take shape in the official record: dangerous autonomy. Reckless independence. A nurse who thought she was a surgeon. By 1015 hours, security was waiting at the nursing station where Laura had begun her shift. The guard's name was Wade. 63 years old, Vietnam service pin on his jacket, the kind of man who'd seen enough institutional cruelty to recognize it when it was happening. But his job was to execute the order, not judge it. Nurse Bennett, Caldwell's voice carried across the station, loud enough for everyone within 30 feet to hear. The morning shift turned, conversations dying mid-sentence. "You're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation." He stood with his arms folded, a man performing justice, a man who'd rehearsed this moment. Performance of procedures outside your scope of practice. Failure to follow established protocols. Insubordination toward attending physicians. Each charge landed like a nail. He cited specifics: the chest tube placement without authorization, the cut-down technique that hadn't been approved, and now the pericardiocentesis, the one that had saved Torres's life, the one that had proven she knew things that civilian nurses weren't supposed to know. Laura could have fought each charge. Could have cited emergency protocols, patient acuity, the absence of the attending physician. Could have said that in a trauma code with a dying patient and no physician present, the nurse becomes the standard of care. But she couldn't say why her hands knew exactly where to place a blind needle. Couldn't explain the muscle memory that came from a place that was supposed to be erased, from a service record that didn't exist, from a Master Chief rank she wasn't allowed to claim. She surrendered her badge in silence. Wade's hand was apologetic when he took it, his grip gentle, and she saw in his eyes that he knew something was wrong here, knew that the narrative being constructed was a lie. The badge was plastic, an identification, 18 months of civilian employment, but it was also the last piece of the cover that had kept her invisible. She surrendered it without protest. The drive home was automatic. Stop signs registered and obeyed. Traffic lights processed. Her hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, the scrub still clinging to her body with the stale smell of hospital antiseptic and her own sweat. The sun was climbing over San Antonio, indifferent to the erasure happening in its light. She sat at the kitchen table still dressed in scrubs, the weight of them suddenly suffocating, the adrenaline gone, the performance finished. Her shoulders began to shake. Not drama. Not performance. Just the physical truth of a body that had held itself together for 18 months and was now allowed to break. Silent sobs came, not loud, not theatrical, but the kind of quiet trembling that happens when you've been holding still so long the release becomes involuntary. Her hands on the table in front of her, the hands that had saved a life and ended a career in the same 8 seconds, and she stared at them as if they belonged to someone else, someone dangerous, someone who didn't belong in this kitchen, in this suburban life, in this city where she was supposed to be invisible. The door opened at 0730. Emma, her 8-year-old daughter, was already dressed for school, her backpack in one hand, her morning confusion shifting to alarm when she found her mother at the table, still in yesterday's clothes, tears streaking her face. The child's instinct was to freeze, then to move forward. She set down her backpack and climbed into Laura's lap, her small arms around her mother's neck, not understanding what was wrong but knowing with absolute certainty that something terrible had happened. "Mommy, why are you home before bedtime?" Emma's voice was small, frightened, the kind of small that children use when they sense an adult's world breaking. "Why are your eyes so red?" Laura couldn't answer. Couldn't explain that she was being erased a second time, that the only identity she'd been allowed to keep was being stripped away, that the choice to save a man's life had cost her everything. She held her daughter tight and let the silence answer for her, let the trembling of her body be the only conversation they could have, let Emma be the only thing real in a moment when everything else had become a lie. 3 days later, a CNN broadcast lit up the hospital lobby like a confession. The screen filled with Laura's photograph in dress uniform, jaw set, eyes the color of storm gray intelligence, the face that didn't exist anymore, the identity that had been erased twice. The Chiron scrolled underneath, decorated Marine medic missing after Tikrit operation, presumed dead. The fluorescent lights hummed above as staff members gathered, phone stopping mid-scroll, conversations dissolving into silence. Commander Torres watched from his wheelchair near the reception desk, chest still bandaged, breathing still measured, alive because of hands that weren't supposed to exist anymore. He stared at the screen for exactly 4 seconds. Then he stood. Not easily, the movement cost him pain that flickered across his face, but he stood, steady, and turned directly toward the crowd of nurses and residents gathering around the television. "Phantom," he said. His voice carried the weight of command, of battlefields, of men who'd learned to speak with absolute certainty. "That's her call sign. That's Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett." The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that comes when reality shifts on its axis. A young resident's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. A nurse pulled her phone down. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. That was when the elderly security guard, the one who'd been working the ER entrance for 17 years, the one who'd come back from Vietnam with a Bronze Star and stories he never told, that was when his whole body went rigid, something in his spine straightening like a man standing at attention. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known. He turned to face the frozen staff and announced to the silent room with the kind of certainty that comes from surviving impossible things, "That woman is a Master Chief Petty Officer. You goddamn fools. You fired a Master Chief." The words hung in the air like they were written in acid. Within the hour, the hospital's main entrance became a stage. A Marine Brigadier General arrived with 2 officers moving in formation, their dress uniforms knife-sharp, they're bearing the kind that makes the air pressure change. He carried a folder stamped with classifications in bold red letters, classified, eyes only, the kind of document that Dr. Caldwell would never have clearance to read, would never be permitted to touch, would never understand. The general's presence moved through the lobby like a controlled storm, his posture that of a man accustomed to giving orders that simply happened. News cameras were already rushing through the lobby doors, reporters sensing the seismic shift in the story. The general stepped toward the assembled hospital staff, the day shift trauma team, the attending physicians, the board members who'd been called in for an emergency meeting, and he began to read. "Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett," he stated, his voice carrying the weight of 26 years of service. "Bronze Star. He paused, letting the word settle. The camera lights intensified. Silver star. Another pause. The staff was completely motionless now, understanding that something was being corrected at a level that transcended hospital policy. 2 purple hearts. He looked up from the citation, made eye contact with the crowd, and continued. And a Navy Cross. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. A 2nd Navy Cross. A 3rd Navy Cross. Each medal became its own sentence, each one a thunderclap of proof that the quiet nurse they'd dismissed, the woman they'd watched be humiliated in grand rounds, the one who'd saved a man's life with her hands, had been operating at a level of service that made hospital protocols look like playground rules. The cameras captured everything. The shock on the faces of attending physicians. The way Katie Rodriguez's hand went to her mouth. The way the room began to understand what it had just done. And then Commander Torres stepped forward, moving with the careful deliberation of a man still healing, and he added the final detail. His voice was quiet, but it cut through everything. She took shrapnel to her back, he said. During a transport run in Tikrit. She was shielding me and 4 other Marines when our vehicle got hit. She took fragmentation rounds that should have killed her. Should have killed all of us. He paused, and his eyes found Laura's in the crowd, meeting them across the chaos of cameras and staff and the unraveling of lies. She's the reason any of us made it out alive. She didn't go on some mission trip for 2 years. She was being put back together. Classified. Erased. And nobody was supposed to know. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the rain beginning outside, drumming against the glass doors like applause from the sky. That was when the general turned toward Dr. Caldwell, who was standing near the physician's lounge, his face moving through colors, white to purple to a shade that suggested he was reconsidering every choice that had led him to this moment. The cameras swung toward him like a weapon. Dr. Stephen Caldwell, the general said, and the formal use of a full name sounded like a death knell. I am here to formally notify you that you have compromised a protected military asset operating under federal classification. He paused, and 2 base security officers stepped forward. They moved like men who'd done this before. Your hospital credentials are suspended immediately. You are barred from these premises pending a federal review of your actions. You have interfered with the care of an active Marine under protection of the United States Military Code. Caldwell's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. You can't, I have patience, you have nothing, the general interrupted, his voice the kind of quiet that carries absolute authority. Remove him. The cameras captured every second as security escorted Caldwell toward the exit, his protests echoing through the lobby like the sound of a career collapsing in real time. Staff members he'd terrorized for years, residents he'd dressed down, nurses he'd publicly mocked, attending physicians he'd bullied into silence, they watched without moving, without defending him, without so much as a glance in his direction. The board members who'd taken his calls, who documented his complaints about Laura's dangerous autonomy, they were already on their phones, already distancing themselves, already issuing statements about independent contractor decisions and no institutional knowledge of the situation. His lawyer called. His wife called. Former colleagues called asking what the hell had happened, their voices carrying the subtext of career-ending infection, the understanding that association with him was now toxic. By that evening, the story had gone viral, hospital fires decorated war hero. Military intervenes after retaliation. The state nursing board closed their investigation within 24 hours after a single phone call from a Pentagon liaison. The hospital launched an internal review, and every policy violation Caldwell had documented became evidence of Laura's extraordinary competence rather than recklessness. She'd performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without waiting for attending approval because she'd recognized a surgical emergency that other physicians had missed, and she'd performed it with textbook precision because she'd done it on living patients under fire. Katie Rodriguez gave a formal statement describing the surgical technique she'd witnessed, the angle of approach, the confidence in hand placement, how it could only have been learned in combat. By week 2, Caldwell's medical license was suspended pending federal review. The investigation revealed that he'd knowingly interfered with the care of a veteran to settle a personal grudge, a violation of multiple federal statutes protecting military personnel under medical care. His attorney told him to expect a lengthy process, possibly permanent revocation. 6 months later, someone spotted him teaching CPR basics at a community college in a strip mall on the south side of San Antonio, standing in front of bored students who had no idea who he used to be, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic torso, making $18 an hour, his hands shaking slightly as he counted compressions out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. His medical license had been quietly revoked on a Friday afternoon. No fanfare. No cameras. Just a letter. Laura kept the worn combat boots in her new locker at the VA hospital system. They'd transferred her with full honors, with formal apologies, with clearances finally documented and declassified. The left boot was still stained with Torres's blood from that transport hit in Tikrit, the physical evidence of a debt that could never be fully paid, only honored. On quiet nights in the trauma bay, she'd lace them on under her scrubs and walk the corridors, her footsteps the only sound in the early morning hours, and she'd remember, not with trembling, but with the clear-eyed focus of someone who'd survived the unsurvivable, she'd remember the faces of the Marines she couldn't save, the ones who'd died in her arms, the ones who'd made it home but never quite came back. Emma understood now, in the way an 8-year-old can comprehend that her mother was something larger than she'd been allowed to know. Torres visited them on a Saturday, moving steadily now, the wound healing, and he placed a tiny flag pin on Emma's jacket and saluted her, and Emma saluted back the way her mother had taught her, and Laura watched from the kitchen doorway as her daughter became the keeper of a truth that was finally allowed to be real. Katie Rodriguez transferred to the VA 3 months later. They never talked about Tikrit directly, but the understanding between them, the kind that only exists between people who've held other people's lives in their hands under fire, that understanding needed no words. They worked side by side in the trauma bay, and sometimes in the quiet moments between emergencies, they'd exchange glances that contained entire wars. On the anniversary of the transport attack, Laura visited Section 60 at Arlington National Cemetery and stood before 3 graves of Marines who died in her arms, men whose names she could still say in her sleep, men whose final breath she'd felt leave their bodies. She knelt, and she whispered the same words she'd said to Torres in that helicopter as the rotors thudded above them and the desert burned red in the distance. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. She saluted, turned, and walked back to the life she was finally allowed to claim, back to a daughter who knew her name, back to a job where her qualifications were listed in a file that existed, back to a future where she didn't have to disappear. Like and subscribe for more stories of heroes walking among us, quiet as ghosts until the moment they save your life.